Way to go, way to go. It's been a phenomenal weekend, just a phenomenal weekend of God's overwhelming presence in this place and in so many people's lives. And there's really just not a greater picture than to see so many, hundreds of students surrendering their lives to Christ. The end of these gatherings and end of these services, Friday nights and Saturday nights, just to see students just coming to God, just surrendering their lives to God. So thank you guys for getting them here, for all of you making sure that you were here. Friday night, we started off this whole Limitless D Now theme with the talk about how God has no limits. He's not limited by space. There's no limit to his wisdom and his knowledge. There's no limit to where God can be in so many places at once. God's not limited by anything. He's not limited in his love for us. And then last night we talked about how to live life, a life with no limits, to live life to the fullest. And today I knew that not only would we have students here, but we have their parents here and family and friends and guests and visitors and newcomers and oldcomers. And so this whole talk today, this theme today of how do we have a faith with no limits, a faith with no limits. And how do we talk to everybody in the room? And so I know that, even here on a Sunday morning, I shared my story that I'd written a book, One Man, One Time, and even all over Valdosta, many people have heard my story, how one man, one time invited me to church, and it changed my life forever. And that was, so long ago, almost 30 years ago. And, but there's a part in my story, there's about a year and a half in my story that I really don't talk about very often. I really don't share about it. One, a lot of times there's just not enough time to give every bit of it. But another part of it is really, it's a part that I'm ashamed of, that I don't like. It's a part of my story that's real messy. And I know growing up, I was raised with my grandmother. And when I would get ready to walk out the door to go to school, my grandmother would have this little radio broadcast on. And it was a guy named Paul Harvey. Anybody ever listen to Paul Harvey? Come on, show your age. Show your age. And so as I was walking out the door, I would hear on the radio, "This is Paul Harvey. And now for the rest of the story." And so this morning, as I talk about a faith with no limits, I really want to share the rest of my story. Growing up my whole life, I tried to prove myself athletically. I always wanted to be the best. And for 7 years old to 14, I played baseball, basketball, and football. And I had a brother who was a year and a half older than me. And man, he was a phenomenal athlete. He would get up at baseball and he'd get to the plate and he'd swing. That ball, it would either hit the fence or go over the fence almost every time. I'd get up there, throw the pitch. Oh. Whoa. Matter of fact, in baseball, they nicknamed me the whiff. I didn't hardly ever hit that little ball. That thing's too small. I don't know. I might have been better at softball. In football, my brother would get the ball and he'd run the touchdown. If I ever got the ball, it just was a fumble. Basketball, they'd call my brother in the clinch. I'll never forget watching him in a middle school game. There was a foul at the end of the game, and it was a tie score, and they needed somebody to shoot the free throws, and they called my brother, Jerry Barkle, into the game. I played basketball for 7 years. The only time I ever got my name called to get in the game was when we needed a foul. Kelly! They didn't even have to tell me to foul nobody. They just knew it was going to happen. And man, I wanted to be the best. I wanted to be the best. When I was a little bit older, about 12 years old, I started boxing. Down in the projects, that little boxing club came up. And I went down there and I thought, I'm pretty good at fighting. So I got in there and I'm boxing around and they thought I was pretty good. I win. I had my first match and it was in a room like this, except a little bigger. And there was a ring and it was just like this all around the ring. I was 12 years old. Whoa. I got in the ring, they rung the bell. People started cheering, tell me to fight. That had never happened before. They usually try to break us up. And man, I got out there, boy, I tore him up. I was pretty good. And then they said, Kel, we're going to take you to another fight. And it was kind of like, they thought I was going to be the best. And I thought I was the best. So they took me in my second fight. They put me in the ring. And it was a guy that had just won the Golden Gloves Championship the year before. And I got it. And I about got the daylights beat out of me. The only thing I figured out was that I was not the best at boxing, for sure. And then I go on to high school and I start wrestling, and I'm pretty good, and I work real hard, getting up, 5 o'clock every single morning for 2 years and working out and all this stuff. I get to my senior year, and about halfway through, I'm 21 wins and 0 losses. I'm thinking, I finally found my thing. I found out where I can be the best. Got to the first match of my senior year, the state tournament, the wrestling, and I pinned the guy in 11 seconds. I thought, man, this is it. And I ended up getting 5th place. And at 47 years old, there's still quiet moments by myself where I still cry a little bit about that 5th place. That hurt. Because I wanted to be the best so bad, it still hurts today. And so then I end up getting on this USA Sambo wrestling team. Sambo is kind of a combination of MMA and Greco-Roman that you see in the Olympic wrestling. And I was pretty good at that. I made the USA team and we went to Morocco and for a World Cup. And then in 1988, I went to the World Championships. And I started out the same way in the World Championships. My first match had a guy from Great Britain, and I almost broke his arm in 18 seconds. And I won. You got submission holds in the Sambo. That's why I liked it. And I went on, I still lost again. And then I was in college, and I thought, it's over. But then my very first semester of college, I took a gymnastics class because they told me I needed a 1-hour credit. And I never had gymnastics in my life. I'd never done tumbling and all that stuff, but in this gymnastics class, that first day, they talk about what we're going to do. Well, afterwards, all these little girls that, had cheered in high school and all that, they was in there, and they started flipping all over the place. They was tumbling, and I said, man, somebody show me how to do that. And so I got in there and put the hand on my back, and I did a backflip. In about 30 minutes, I was doing backflips and round off backflips and back handsprings and backflip, round off, twisting all over the place, toe touch backflips. They said, we've been trying to do that our whole life. So they came up to me after all that was over, and they said, hey, they said, Kelly, they said, man, you ought to try out for the cheerleading team. I said, hold up. I said, what you talking about? I'm from the hood, man. I ain't never seen a guy cheering before. You crazy? I was a little offended. And then I started going to these football games and basketball games. I saw these big guys, they were throwing girls all over the place, 100 feet in the air, and they were flipping all over. So at the end of that first year, I tried out. And they had just came back from the National Cheerleading Championship that you see on ESPN. They got first place. And so I thought, wow, man, it's another opportunity. I can be the best at something. They're national champs. I'm going to make the team, and we're going to win nationals again. I'm going to be the best. So I tried out, and I made it. And not very long into that first year, they kind of bumped me down off the varsity team. And so I came back the next year and tried out again. And same thing, I made it. And this time, man, I was doing good on the team the whole year, 11 months. I was going to work, and we practiced every single day. They were national champs, and to this day, they're the winningest school in the nation, and national championships for cheerleading. And so I was going to do it, and about 11 months into it, practicing every day, coach calls me to his office. I go in, I sit down, and he said, Kelly, he said, we got to take you off. I said, what do you mean? I said, we're a month away. We got to take you off. And there were some other things going on in my life at the time. But listen, up to this point, at 18 years old, I surrendered my life to Christ. At 18 years old, man, I just gave my life to Jesus and put my trust in him, my faith in him. I never was supposed to go to college, but I ended up going to college. And when I went to college, I started going on weekend trips to Methodist churches and doing lay witness weekends, they were called. And I would speak at all of them. And I was on fire for Jesus. And I would speak at FCA huddle groups all over Kentucky. And I didn't know the Bible, but I just had my story, how one man one time invited me to church. And I accepted Jesus. Listen, I was sold out for God, man. I was just on fire for God. I was living for him, doing everything for him. I had no idea that my faith had a limit. I had no idea that my faith had a limit, but it did. In my disappointment and in the crushing of my little ego, I had reached a faith limit that I didn't even realize that I had. On the airplane from Lexington, Kentucky to San Antonio that year in college to the national championship that I wasn't going to be on the floor and I was just going to watch, I took my first drink that I had ever taken since before I had given my life to Jesus. And after I took that first drink, I just didn't stop for about 1.5 years. And I discovered that my faith had a limit that I didn't even know about. Like so many people, I just kind of under pressure, I discovered that my faith was not in Christ alone. I didn't know that at the time. And I had not been discipled or in Sunday schools or anything like this. But my faith was limited on whether or not God was good to me. It ended up being the fact that my faith was actually limited on whether or not God was blessing me. My faith was limited on whether God was making sure that life went my way, the way that was smooth, the way that made a smile on my face. My faith was limited to whether or not I succeeded or whether or not I failed. As long as things were good, I had faith. When life got tough, my faith crumbled under pressure. It was as if, God changed my life. And the experience was amazing. Like so many of you have experienced too. I discovered his love. I found a new love for myself. I saw his grace. My life really was transformed. I was doing all this stuff for God for 3 or 4 years. Things were great and my faith was growing stronger every day until I felt so much like a failure. Until some of you adults in here right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know exactly what I'm saying. As I go through my story and run to this point where I have an until moment, I bet that many of you had that same experience in some different way, shape, or form where you surrendered your life to God. There was a time where you knelt down. Maybe it was at vacation Bible school. Maybe it was at Sunday school. Maybe it was at a church service or a big camp meeting. Maybe it was by yourself, but you surrendered to God. You sold out to God and things were going great. Everything was fine. You were living for him and doing it all until. What's your until moment? Your faith was strong until you got that bad news. Your faith was strong until you found out that your spouse was sleeping with somebody else. Your faith was strong until your parents divorced. Your faith was strong until you lost somebody that you loved and care about deeply. Your faith was strong until life's circumstances just didn't go your way. Over 20 years ago, when I first graduated from college, I was teaching middle school. And when I was teaching middle school, the principal had told me, she said, "Kel, you can't talk about God unless somebody asks you about God." And so one day in class, a student asked me about God. And so I said, "Hey, everybody gather around here." And so all the students gathered around. And I said, "Hey, such and such asked me about God." I said, "What do you guys think about God?" And this was a long time. This was like 20 years ago, 23 years ago now, 22 years ago. And I'll never forget that classroom. It just impacted me because as we went around the room with about 30 students, so many of them said similar things. They said, well, Kelly, I used to believe in God until my grandmother died. And then others would say, I used to believe in God until blank. I used to believe in God until... And they all had this until moment. So many of them had this until moment in their lives. Listen, do you have an until moment in your recent past? Most of you know about David in the Bible. David was anointed by Samuel the prophet when he was young. David, the king, became king. David that believed and trusted in God. And his belief and trust and faith in God allowed him to kill the lion and the bear. And he went on to kill Goliath and become king. And David was loving God and he was living for God. And God even says he was a man after his own heart. And David was trusting God until... And many of you know this story, and Bathsheba was bathing on that sun deck, and David was living for God until he looked over and saw Bathsheba. If you're not familiar with the story, he sees her, sends after her, she comes, and they sleep together. She ends up getting pregnant, and David didn't want nobody to know that he was that baby daddy. And so he kind of arranged some things to get her husband to come back so maybe they would sleep together, and they didn't. So then he kind of works it out and rearranges the whole thing. You have to read the whole story, but he makes sure that her husband is in the front line of the battle, so he's going to be killed, and he is. He's killed. Now you can make the argument that David never lost his faith. That's cool. However, it's very clear that David definitely lost his faithfulness. Because he was faithful to God until... Listen, I'm talking about this today because like me, David describes this time as the most miserable time of his life. When David turned his back on God, when David began to walk away from God, when David began to do his own thing and not God's thing, he started going from bad to worse. His life began to spiral out of control. And that's exactly what happened to my life. That's exactly what happened to some of your lives who are in here today. You were living for God. You were loving God. You were surrendered to God until blank. And if you look back, that's when your life began to spiral out of control. Sin led to more sin. Bad led to worse. You were doing fine with God. You were faithful to Him until... Listen what David said in Psalms 32, verse 3 and 4. David said, when I kept silent, when he was doing all the stuff, when he was in sin, when he was turning his back from God, when he was in that until moment, he said, I kept silent. He said, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. It's as if he's experienced this excruciating pain of his bones wasting away. That's how bad it hurt. For day and night your hand was heavy on me, but my strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. In the end of really the most miserable year of my life, running from God for a year and a half, my life spiraling out of control, losing my grant money at college, being thrown in jail for fighting. Polly, who my wife now for 23 years, Polly and I, who I was dating at the time, she came to me and she said she was pregnant. And it was in that very instant that I knelt down and I asked her, and I hadn't prayed for a year and a half. I hadn't stopped drinking for a year and a half, stopped smoking stuff for a year and a half. All that stupid stuff. I'd spiraled out of the control from that until moment. And I asked her if she would pray with me. And I remember praying and telling God, I'm sorry. I confessed my mess to God and told him I was sorry. God, I love you. I believe in you. And I would realize in that moment that my faith was not based on Christ alone. My faith was based on whether or not everything was going okay. And listen, that was a little over 23 years ago. And from that moment on, my faith has had no limits. My faithfulness has had no limits. Not because I'm good, not because of my willpower, because from that moment on, my faith was no longer based on life circumstances or anything that the world throws at me. From that moment on, my faith was based on Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. And He's never changed. And since He's never changed and He's my foundation, that's why my faithfulness has not changed. Not because of me. Yeah, give it for Jesus. And I just know that several of us have that until moment. Let me tell you what made the difference and has allowed me to live out a faith with no limits. I made a commitment at that bedside prayer, that my faith, it would be in God, and my faithfulness to God would be based on one thing, and that's Jesus Christ alone. And honestly, from that bedside prayer, I was drunk the night before, and I've not touched one drink of anything since that moment. And people say, "Oh, were you saying you can't drink?" I'm saying I can't. They said, "Well, what about a social drink?" I've never taken a social drink, so I know I can't. But from that moment on, completely sold out. Because it wasn't based on if God was blessing me or if God was good to me. It's based on Jesus and Jesus alone. For my faith to be without limits, it had to be based on Christ alone. The God who made me, the God who loved me, who died for me, who changed me, who gave me a new life. He is my life. My faith had to rest on Him alone, the unchanging, faithful God. Life changes, situations change. Things don't always go my way, but it's okay because Jesus is the way. My faith is no longer based on circumstances, heartbreak, tragedy. It can't be. It can't be. If it is, you're going to have an until moment in your life. You're going to have a story with that misery like me and David. My faith's not limited by whether or not all things work out for my good because I love God and because I trust God. If your faith is based in Christ alone, listen, you won't have that miserable until moment in time and season in your life. And that's why I wanted to talk about this morning, because I know that so many of you, you're committed to Jesus and you're sold out to Jesus. But listen, you've got to get it in you now, the foundation that your life, your faith, your faithfulness has to be based on Jesus and Jesus alone because of what He's done on the cross. That's it. Because you're going to run into stuff like I ran into. You're going to run into stuff like your parents ran into. The Bible says there's no new temptation under the sun. So you're going to run into the same stuff. And for you to make it to the end of the road and look back and have no regrets and have no until moment, your faith and your faithfulness has got to be based on Jesus alone. Listen, be honest with God. Some of you who are here, some of you parents, some of the relatives, some of the sponsors, be honest with God and be honest with yourself. If you have an until story, do what I did at that bedside 23 years ago. Confess your mess to God. Realize that your faith actually did have a limit. And let God know that from this moment on, your faith and your faithfulness to Him will be based on Jesus and Jesus alone. Listen, David did the same thing at the end of his unfaithfulness. Here's what he said. David said, "Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquities. I came out of the closet. I quit having a secret. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord." And listen, some of you maybe have a recent until moment. You have a recent until story. This is you. This is your day for you to come clean, for you to come and confess your mess to the Lord. And listen, here's what it says. "And God forgave the guilt of my sin. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance." That's awesome when it says, "And you forgave the guilt of my sin." Because we get that God forgives our sins. But how amazing is it that God forgives and takes away the guilt of our sin? That what you've done up to that until moment, in that until season of your life, that when you confess it to God, not only does He forgive you, but He takes away the guilt of it all. That's how good our God is. And for some of you adults this morning, and some of you maybe even older teens, that's for you. You were living for God, loving God, surrendered to God until somebody broke the relationship. Until I started hanging out with this group of people. Until my parents did this. Until you fill in the blank. It's time for you to put your faith back in Jesus and Jesus only. It's the only way that you can remain faithful and experience the joy of the Lord for the rest of your life. So I want to have kind of 2 commitment times this morning. So as the band begins to come, let me first talk to maybe some of you who you say, yeah, Kelly, you know what, man, you're talking right at me. I can tell you when I accepted Jesus, and I can tell you how long I was living for Him and until... And you're able to fill in the blank. And this first part is for you. And this morning, the 9:30 service, it was so awesome to see so many adults making commitments. So I'm going to give you an opportunity this morning as well, that if you relate to what I'm saying about living for God, and you made a commitment to God, and you were faithful until, you've kind of gotten away from Him. Your story kind of says, I used to. You have a lot of used tos in your story when it comes to good things about God. If you just bow your heads and close your eyes, then listen, for all of you that kind of find yourself in that spot, that you used to live for God, you used to be real faithful to God, you've kind of gotten away from it. You kind of see that, like I did 23 years ago, like David did when he saw Bathsheba, that you can kind of look back and you can see where you kind of started to walk away from God. You turned away from God. You were faithful until. But this morning you say, Kelly, man, I hear what you're saying. I feel that misery, what it's like. But today, like David did, like you did at the bedside today, I want to confess that was me, that I've been a mess. And from this day forward, my faith is not going to be in those circumstances or what anybody does to me or around me. But from this day forward, I'm coming back to Jesus. And my faith and my faithfulness will be on Jesus and Jesus alone and what He did on the cross. With everybody's heads bowed and their eyes closed. Listen, if that's you, would you just lift your head up and raise your hand so we can see you? Just make eye contact with me if that's you. I see. Way to go. Way to go. Anybody else say, man, I got an until moment. That's me. But today I confess all that junk. I'm coming back to Him.